great opportunities as well as challenges, and those principally arise out of the decarbonisation and the green agenda. That is, of course, a challenge. We said we're going to be going to net zero by 2050, and the UK's domestic maritime fleet, of course, falls within that target. But there's also huge opportunities there as well, because instead of, I firmly believe that instead of simply looking at this as something we've got to do, it's also something that we can look to get advantage from as well. So that we look to get ahead, to get some first mover advantage, and to really capitalise on showing not only why we have an amazing world-beating port and maritime sector, but why we also have an amazing world-beating technology sector as well. So it's really great to join you all today. As I say, lots of challenges, but also lots of opportunities. I'm looking forward to discussing everything today.
Thank you, Robert. Over to you, Doug. Doug is the Chief Executive of the Port of Dover.
Thank you very much, Henry. Welcome, everyone. When we start to think about trade resilience at the Port of Dover, we take a systemic view, the whole system. Simply looking at port capacity or land adjacent to a port is terribly one-dimensional in looking at the complete supply chain. We consider operating models, frequencies, capacities, efficiencies, the vessels. So by illustration, if you look at our operating model, we turn our berths over 10 times every day. Other ports may do it once or maybe twice a day. Our vessels complete up to 5 round voyages in a single day, making them really super productive assets. By comparison, some ports that require the longer voyages may get 1 round voyage a day, and effectively then requiring up to 5 times the number of ships to provide the same frequencies and capacities that we can in Dover. Now in 2018, Oxera did a study into the ability for moving up to 20% of Dover's traffic by other modes and other ports. What they determined is that it would be somewhere between 2 and 3 billion pounds investment burden just for new ships. Importantly, these ships don't exist today, and shipyard capacity and building, it means that it probably won't exist for many, many years to come. Under other operating models, such as containers and unaccompanied trailers, inbound dwell times might be several hours or even several days. At Dover, our average inbound dwell time is 5 minutes. That yields tremendous advantages for the supply chains. Other operating models with longer, less frequent sea voyages, if you happen to miss a sailing, you might have to wait a day to get another boat, resulting in inefficiency and risk to the supply chain. At Dover, there's another ferry coming in about an hour. Plus, with our turn up and go model, that means the traffic is just continuously moving, again, yielding tremendous advantage for the supply chains. Now, there is potential disruption as a result of Brexit, but it's going to be common disruption for any EU-facing gateway. The difference with Dover is that we've got a clear track record of managing disruption and, really importantly, recovering the situation. We have a proven traffic management scheme and have been refining our plans over the last 4 years in Kent in preparation for Brexit. I'll give you a couple of examples. So during the COVID pandemic, Dover kept the critical supply chains open and operational, ensuring that the essential goods made it into the United Kingdom. Where freight capacity was reduced, or in some cases it might have been eliminated altogether, the Port of Dover was fully operational throughout. In fact, during the height of the pandemic, we were still lifting up to 10,000 passengers every day. And that is because our ferries keep running and people know that they can count on us. Second example, about a fortnight ago, we had a nationwide security operation where all traffic leaving all gateways was subjected to additional screening and searches. Now, this clearly affected Dover's traffic, and therefore Operation Stack was implemented. At the height of the Stack operation, it was estimated that we might have had about 4,500 lorries queued up. Within 12 hours of the operation being concluded, we had everything cleared and we were back to normal operation. This was down to the professional people that we had, our clear geographic advantage, and the high frequency services that we have. It's a clear demonstration of managing real time, managing disruption, but then really important, recovering it swiftly. Where else in the United Kingdom could this have been accomplished? Nowhere. Now, few people would say that they enjoy Operation Stack. and it does carry a highly criticized reputation, but it is a proven traffic management scheme deployed in extreme conditions. Over the past 10 years, in fact, it's only been activated a handful of times, other than the events of the summer of 2015. And it represents less than 0.1% of our total operating time. In addition to Operation Stack, we've got our A20 tap that we brought in place with working with Highways England and other parties in Kent. And we also have our buffer zone at the port, which was part of an £85 million investment. And all of these provide continuous and proportionate traffic management. Now, we look at resilience, as I say, in a systemic way, but we're also looking at resilience over the long term. You can see that we have it very, very high on our agenda, but we're not simply resting on our superior product, nor our clear geographic advantage. We're planning for the future. As a part of the government's flagship Freeports program, we've developed a Freeports model that leverages our premier position and advanced operating model. With over half our freight destined north of London, the reach from the Port of Dover is across the entire nation. In our model, or our Freeports model, our so-called global trade and innovation zone, we're building a powerful coalition across manufacturing, supply chains, advanced engineering, and academia. We're working with the Center for Sustainable Road Freight, and we're working towards establishing the United Kingdom's very first zero emissions logistics corridors. Our aim through our forward-looking developments is to ensure resilience and indeed sustainable supply chains for the UK economy and the UK society to continue to prosper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Henry, and good afternoon, everyone. As I'm sure most people are aware, the UK is home to an incredibly diverse automotive sector, from large mass market OEMs like Nissan up in the northeast, through to small volume manufacturers like Aston Martin Lagonda, and off-highway manufacturers like JCB, and a great many specialist manufacturers. In total, we're home to 85 OEMs and over 2,500 suppliers. This diversity is unique to the UK, and we're home to some incredibly innovative suppliers. Though over time, our supply chain has become more integrated with Europe, as efficiency has driven greater consolidation across the continent. So to flavour that up a little bit and give you a bit of numbers, what does that look like? Well, last year, the industry had a combined turnover of 82 billion. We invested over 7 billion in capital and R&D projects, manufactured over 1.3 million cars and 78,000 commercial vehicles, and we exported over 1 million of those vehicles. And last but not least, we employed over 800,000 people. So the industry is an important bedrock of the UK economy, and certainly a contributor to our balance of trade. But margins in the industry are traditionally very tight, with some companies operating on as little as 3 to 4%, meaning that even a small additional cost could mean the difference between profit and loss. From an Aston Martin perspective, we're a luxury car manufacturer, traditionally making sports cars and GT cars in the Midlands at Gaydon. But earlier this year, we opened our new manufacturing site in South Wales, making our first SUV, the Aston Martin DBX. So we're spread across the UK, across the heartlands of the UK anyway. And as I mentioned earlier on, we are what's termed a small volume manufacturer. We make less than 10,000 vehicles a year. In fact, last year, we only made 5,862 sports cars at our Gaydon manufacturing facility, 80% of which were exported around the world. A good chunk of those went through Dover. And we are, with our largest market being the United States. Compare this to the 385,000 cars that Jaguar Land Rover made last year, and you get a sense of scale. We are very, very small in comparison. However, despite that difference in scale, our manufacturing and supply chain processes are very similar, with a large proportion of our supply chain spend in Europe, meaning that we need to bring parts in and cars through a gateway, nominally the short straits, Dover-Calais. However, unlike the larger manufacturers, we do have more UK suppliers, though these tend to be the smaller, bespoke luxury components that we use in our cars, from leather and other materials to essential enamelled badges and other luxury products. We too rely on just-in-time manufacturing to ensure that we are cost efficient in our manufacturing processes. As an example, we currently bring in approximately 290 trucks a week to service our manufacturing plants. The vast bulk of that comes through Dover, the short straits. Therefore, supply chain resilience, as Doug was talking about, is essential to our business and to other car manufacturers. We work closely with our logistics partners to ensure that we have sufficient resilience in that supply chain to manage any disruption. However, disruption costs and additional costs impact our ability to be competitive. So with the challenges ahead, with Brexit, COVID, well, I wouldn't say in the rearview mirror, but certainly around us at the moment as well, we need to work together to ensure we're able to maintain the competitive of what I would class an important sector to the UK economy, the automotive sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Now, before we move on to the discussion and the Q&A, I understand that the video we meant to play at the beginning has now been teed up and is ready to go. So hopefully that will now start running imminently.
For centuries, the Port of Dover has served our nation, expanding beyond its geographic advantage to accelerate the pace of British business. As the UK embarks on a new course, Dover is adapting again, securing vital supply chains, embracing the opportunity of global trade, and driving sustainability to create the UK's first zero-emissions logistics corridors. Dover is supporting businesses across the UK, attracting investment and supporting exporters to create new jobs, fostering public and private sector collaboration and innovation. Dover will always be the key to the kingdom, the key that drives our economic success. The Port of Dover, the key to the future, the port of the future.
Marvelous. Right. And so now we can begin. So Chair's prerogative. I'm going to start by asking a question or two of my own, and then if there's more coming in, we can see how we go. Now I'm going to start with a question for Doug. Based on that video just said that Dover is sort of the port of the future. Now you said in your opening remarks you've talked about Dover being resilient and sustainable. Now resilient seems fairly self-explanatory in terms of being able to withstand shocks, keep trade flowing and everything else. But for those of us who aren't trade specialists, what do you mean by sustainable? What does it mean to be for British trade lanes to be sustainable? Over what sort of timescale are we talking about here?
Thank you, Henry. I think when we start considering sustainable, it's the whole package of the logistics change. Moving freight by water is one of the most carbon efficient ways to do so. But then also the way in which we're looking at developing our port and our energy usage at the port, in fact, our own energy generation. This is a part of our major Dover Western Docks Revival program. We've implemented a full suite of PVs on the roof of our refrigerated warehouse, and it's supplying, certainly during the summertime, all the power that we need. And that is a really good point around making certain that as we are developing and investing in infrastructure, that we're doing it and we're embedding the sustainability into it. As we look to develop our free ports, our global trade and innovation zone, we'll be looking at working with some advanced engineering, some academia, the Center for Sustainable Road Freight, and how we can actually ensure that our logistics and our supply chains are, well, we're going to be trying for zero emissions in the first instance. I hope that helps, Henry.
That does, absolutely. Does Robert mentioned in it, and obviously if any of the other panelists want to come in on any of these questions, I may start off by firing them to one of you, but just raise a hand, and I'll come to you. Now Robert mentioned in his opening remarks that the move to zero, whilst it does obviously have opportunities that you've just outlined, it does potentially pose challenges with the transition. So are there any ways in which the government's move towards net zero has thrown up new hurdles for the Port of Dover, things that you're going to have to overcome, change your timelines on the adoption of different technologies or methods?
You know, Henry, there's a range of things that are out there. Some of the technologies are just not industrial strength yet, but some of the proven ones, such as the photovoltaics and maybe a bit of wind, that can all happen. A good example of a technology that's not quite there yet is so-called cold ironing, which is basically plugging a ship in when it's alongside rather than have it run on its generators. because of the energy draw, right now there is insufficient generation capacity to be able to pull that amount of energy onto a vessel. Particularly hungry ones are cruise ships, by the way. So what we need to do is we'll need to see some investment in the national infrastructure, as well as what happens in the port, in order to start really moving forward on some of the carbon agenda.
And that seems to me to set up a perfect question for Robert, which is, what is the in light of that, you know, a lot of this Port of Dover can't do big R&D development and everything else. What is the government doing to try and make sure that, given these sort of the targets that it has set itself, that these technologies come on stream in time for car manufacturers, to the ports and other industries, to be able to make this transition in an orderly fashion and hit those targets? Oh, Robert, you're still muted, sorry.
Sorry, schoolboy error. Henry, that's an excellent point, and you're absolutely put your finger on you know, all of the things that we're talking about today. So Doug has made a number of good points there, and he's really illustrated how interlinked everything is. Because when you talk about you know, clean maritime, for example, you obviously have the fuels, you have the ships themselves, how they're constructed, you have the way that they're operated in terms of literally how they move around, you have the way that they are loaded, you have the way that things get to the port to be loaded. So it's all massively interlinked, and it's very much a, you know, a lattice work of you know, of policy things that have to be looked at. I think it's fair to say we're fairly early on in this at the moment. We are still looking at a lot of different policy options. And that just first part of the answer I gave, I think, illustrates how that is. So, you know, there will be things like clean fuels that can be looked at, for example. We'll have to look at how ships are constructed. We'll have to look at how ships are loaded. You've got the dockside loading part of things as well. So we've done quite a lot of research on this, and a lot of this is published on gov.uk, and it's all part of our Clean Maritime Plan and the Council, which is a consultative body that we have. And we're looking at a number of different policy options, and I've referred to some of them already, you know, for example, clean fuels, but then you look at things like hydrogen, and then you have things like ammonia. All of this it's early days, which is why I say there's an opportunity there as well as a challenge. So it's far too early for me to say that anything is going to be a particular solution, but what I absolutely can say is that we're looking at all of them.
Okay, and James, if I can just come to you quickly. I know that some car manufacturers, you mentioned Jaguar Land Rover, have been concerned that the way that the government has been legislating for the move towards zero emissions means that it's doing so in such a way that might be undermining transitional technologies. Do you think that there is more the government could be doing to make sure that car manufacturers, as they do prepare to move towards maybe wholly electric vehicles, have the space maybe for things like does clean diesel, for example, have a role to play, or is there another solution that's needed?
Well, there's about a dozen questions in there, Henry. I'll try and come back with a short response.
The chairman's answer is to just answer whichever one you like the best.
I think the industry, just to make it clear, the industry is wholly committed to reducing carbon. We've got to beat this climate agenda head on. I think, however, picking technologies or picking winners is a mistaken approach to take. We need to allow innovation to happen. Obviously, government's job is to provide a framework, targets to meet, for example, on reduction. I think, I won't speak for other car companies, but where investment has been made into new technology, companies need to recoup that investment to be able to make the next investment. If you ban a certain technology when a company has invested in it, and you don't allow them to recoup that, then they can't have, they have no money to invest in the next technology. So this is such an emerging place, as Rob said. You know, we've got so many things changing all the time. We need to be fluid. We need to allow industry to innovate. That's what they do best. The car industry in the UK is very innovative, as I said in my opening remarks, and just provide that sort of glide path. So yeah, I think there's a whole multitude there. We shouldn't discount hybridization as part of the solution. Rob mentioned clean fuels. I think hydrogen is going to play a very, very serious role in HGV. Potentially even in some of the sort of the larger light commercial vehicles. Battery electric certainly is the core for cars, but I think hybridization has still some role to play out into the 2030s. Clean diesel, I think that's there. I think the doom mongers have put pay to diesel, frankly. You can see the figures from our trade association on number of diesel registrations this year. It's right down. But diesel plays an important mix in decarbonising. If you don't buy a new diesel, you're driving an old diesel perhaps, or an old petrol, and they're far worse than driving a new one. So I think it's technology neutrality. Let's the industry innovate as best it possibly can, with the targets in mind of net zero by 2050.
Okay, and if I might just quickly just bounce back to you, Robert, before we move on to the next question. How do you think the government can, because obviously the temptation is, or the danger is always there when the government gets involved in things that involve R&D and developing technologies and industries. The danger is always that the charge of picking winners will be leveled and that you might distort the market. So how do you think the government can best make sure that whilst providing a supportive framework and indeed public investment if necessary, the government makes sure that the technologies that come through this process are the most competitive and are not perhaps the most politically attractive for some reason or another one?
Yeah, and again, very good point. And it's one of the challenges that you always have when you're assessing policy in this area. It won't surprise you that coming from a Conservative politician speaking at a ConservativeHome event, that I firmly believe not only that technology holds the answers to the climate challenge that we have, but that the market is the best place to produce those answers. And that will obviously underpin everything that the government does. I think the key is seeing any investment that there were put in terms of research and development. It's particularly the research side of things. It's making sure that lots of different options can come forward that gives government and industry the choice to see what emerges and what becomes most successful. As I say, we are very early on in this process yet. There's a long way to go, but it's particularly on making sure the market is able to explore and to innovate. That'll be key.
Okay, so now going to move on to the question of resilience, and I'm going to bounce back to Doug again, because I think Doug said something at the beginning of his opening remarks which I thought was very interesting, which is that he talks about a two-dimensional understanding of resilience and how it can focus too much on the immediate surroundings of the port and all of that. So obviously this is an open event, lots of us here won't be trade specialists. From your perspective, what are the big the dangers, potential pitfalls, challenges throughout the supply chain that you, when you're overseeing the Port of Dover and you're risk assessing, what is it that's on your radar? What are you looking out for?
Thanks, Henry. I think the vessel capacities is a pretty important one. We have seen a number of operations suspend or lay up some tonnage during the COVID while the freight volumes came down. And I think in order for the nation to have, its trade resilience, the security and the vessel capacity, and clearly if you can deploy a ship where it can make more round trips in a day, it is more productive for the day's worth of activity. I think also drivers become quite important. I think whether you're shipping containers or unaccompanied or accompanied trailers, I think making certain that we've got the right drivers or enough of them that they're appropriately permitted as well when we leave when we finish the transition period. And I think that just that general capacity there. Clearly, there's also rail capacity and making certain that we are perhaps trying to shift more cargo off the road and onto the railroad, and that's also good for the sustainability as well of the supply chains. So really, I think the things folks should be. Well, actually, I should say one other thing, and that is when we end transition, we're going to have to do a whole bunch more customs paperwork than we did before as being a part of the European Union. And importantly, this is going to happen whether we have a deal or we don't have a deal. We're still going to need to do this customs paperwork. And so what that means is that I think, for the supply chains, the importers and the exporters, to make certain that you've secured the capacity for the production of that paperwork, either, by investing in your own ability to be able to generate it, or indeed contracting with an intermediary. I think that is going to be an important aspect of resilience.
Okay, well, I think that's just a sort of example for people like us who don't really think about it, who maybe think that it is all about lorry queues and everything else, just how much really goes into making sure that a port like Dover operates at full capacity. So on the question of this is related to resilience. So this is our first question from the audience. This is from Kyle, and he says, whilst Dover is a key port connecting us to Europe, are we building capacity at other strategic ports across the UK to manage imports? And I suppose this is a question to Robert first of all. And you know, if not, should we be? Now, Doug in his opening remarks said that capacity doesn't currently exist, and obviously other ports would be further away. But is there a case for expanding port capacity elsewhere? Would that make the British system a little less reliant on one hub, or can we do everything as it is? So I'll start with Robert for that one.
Thanks, and Carl, yeah, it's a great question. So there's a number of different points to answer here. I mean, Doug, I think, has just illustrated quite neatly how many different moving parts there are in any part of the port system. Henry just acknowledged that, of course, it's not just about the ships themselves, it's things like getting the drivers there as well. And that just shows that any resilience has to be in terms, its depth as well as width. And it's a mistake to think of resilience purely in terms of width. Of finding other locations. It's the depth of the resilience as well. So you ensure that the train freight capacity is up to scratch. You check that you've got the drivers, you check that you've got the amount of onloading and offloading facilities that are required. So there's that as well. So it's important to think about it in three-dimensional terms. So whilst the government will be looking at resilience, that's going to be very much a big part of it as well. Dover is always going to be very important because of the short straits and because of the closeness to the continent at Calais. There's no two ways about that. That's absolutely the case. But let's not forget there are also a great many other important ports around the UK anyway.
Okay, and just because it's very related to that, I'm going to bring in another a question from Lynn Faulkner. What about the 250 million freight ferry terminal at Tilbury Docks? Do you have that just seems to be a natural follow-up. So if you've got any comments regarding that before I move on.
I think I'd just say that's a very good example of another of the great facilities that we have. There's a great many that we could rattle off, of course. There's a place like Southampton where I went and visited the other day. So there's that as well. There's a great number of great facilities we already have around the UK.
Okay, right. So the next question is going to be obviously we often, when we think about Dover, especially, we think about the impact on the immediate environment. You know, the counties around the south coast and everything else. But obviously, as we've all sort of established, it plays an absolutely crucial role in the national trade network. So, as the government, what more can this do to help the government's levelling up agenda? You know, investment in ports in the south. To some people, it might not sound immediately like that is fulfilling the government's pledge to boost the economy in the Midlands and the North. So how does this kind of investment in concrete ways, and I think James can probably help us with this as well, how in concrete terms does investing in this kind of trade infrastructure on the south coast, how are the benefits felt in the Midlands, the North, and even, you know, in Scotland and Wales?
Yes, you really put your key on an important part there of trade. And it's one of the reasons why free trade is the greatest driver of prosperity that humans have ever invented. And it's one of the reasons why it's been such a part of this government's agenda. And it's simply because you have to have goods and people moving around freely. So if you are able to have parts move quickly and they move efficiently across the channel and then through Dover and then through the country, then you have much easier opportunities for companies that might be existing in the Midlands or that might be in the North in order to get involved in whatever that industry is. So that's why investing in transport infrastructure of all kinds throughout the UK very much opens up business opportunities to all of those regions of the UK.
Okay, James, do you have any comments on that one?
Well, I completely agree. As I said in my opening gambit, we have facilities across the Midlands and into South Wales, and the trade flow from those to those and from those largely goes down through Kent. So you know, it's a long way away to Cardiff from Dover, or indeed up to the northeast where Sunderland make their cars, or where Nissan make their cars. So I guess the levelling up agenda, we need to have efficient transport networks. And as Doug said earlier on, it's about the whole system. We need to think about not just, you know, when I reference our supply chain, I would consider Dover or the Channel Tunnel as being part of that supply chain. You know, we are putting a car onto a vehicle. That vehicle, we don't get paid until it reaches its destination. So it is within our interest to make sure it gets to its destination as quickly and as problem-free as possible. Equally, just in time requires us to have components line side just in time. So we need to make sure we have that entire network. And on the point that you mentioned earlier on around the sort of the customs declaration paperwork, this is frightening. I mean, even for big companies, getting a grip of the capacity they're going to require, the number of customs declarations they're going to have to do every day, every week, every month, every year, etc., and recruiting that staff in an environment that is thin on the ground, should we say, with expertise. There are government schemes, grants to train people, but if you're an SME and you've never done this before, getting your head around this in the evening over dinner because you run a business during the day, that's really worrying. And for companies like Aston Martin, where we deal with a lot of SMEs, a lot of small companies, as I said, our UK supply chain is largely geared towards the SME community. We are having to train, we're having to take our suppliers under our wing and say, this is the paperwork you need to do. So there's a lot of challenges there, but it's the ecosystem. We've got to make sure the ecosystem is right.
Perfect. Okay. So this is a question which has come in from the audience, which I think is going to go to Doug, because it refers to something that you mentioned earlier. Terry Price says, Mr. Bannister has just mentioned the paperwork will be required, deal or no deal. Can this be put out as can this be spread around, because the media is currently saying that the need for paperwork will be a major disadvantage of no deal. So could you possibly expand a bit, because there is I think there is a lot of confusion and concern about this. What will the paperwork requirements be, and what is the difference between, for you as a port operator, between a deal or no deal in terms of the amount of extra paperwork that will be required and the burdens that might place on your processes and systems?
Yeah, I think the government had published, I think it was back in July, the border operating model. And that was a very good description of how all the in a way, the document or the paperwork flows would work. And the other thing that the government has done is that they have implemented a phased approach to inbound clearances. So it's not really until the 1st of July next year when the increased checks would be in place. Now, I think that the government's been trying to get the message out that the paperwork or the customs declarations, and indeed perhaps security declarations and that sort of stuff, that indeed that's going to happen almost no matter what. And I think maybe this is something that we could all jointly go back to government with and say, we could be doing a bit better on getting the messaging out, it seems. In terms of Dover, one of the things that is also contained within the border operating model is a port could either have a temporary storage approval or something called a pre-lodgement approval. And basically under the pre-lodgement, what that's meant to do is allow us to carry on doing our business in the exact same way that we do today. And indeed, the temporary storage would work the same way for unaccompanied trailers and for containers as well. So government is thinking through how to make certain that we have the most efficient delivery of these supply chains. And there is still some way to go.
Okay. So Robert, I'd like to go to you on the same question with an added question. Short one, I promise, from Lewis Webb, who says, has HMRC leveraged technology to facilitate customs paperwork? So I suppose the question is the same. What impact do you, obviously the negotiations are ongoing, we don't want to prejudge them, but what do you anticipate the impact of new customs paperwork to be? And as Lewis says, what steps has the government and the civil service taken already, and are they taking to try and make sure that any new requirements are as little onerous as possible?
So that's absolutely right. We shouldn't prejudge the outcome of the negotiations, clearly. And obviously there will be a change. I think everyone will accept that at the end of the period. It's a big change as we come out of the transition period. So some things will change. There will be a change in the way that some things take place, and everybody has to prepare for that. The government has had a major campaign, the Check, Change, Go campaign, and you may have seen around in newspapers, on television, that there's been a big campaign asking companies to check. There's a big social media campaign. There's a lot of information online. There's a great deal on the Gov UK website. And of course, lots of the trade bodies are a big campaign being run by government and run by associated bodies to help people get ready. And if there is anybody watching or anybody who is simply concerned about what they may have to do, then I would ask them to reach out. First of all, look at gov.uk and also reach out to their trade bodies, because there is a lot of help out there, and either they or the government will be glad to provide it. In terms of the latter part of the question, yes, I can confirm that there is all sorts of work across in order to help make processes as smooth as possible. Technology is always a part of that, where possible, of course.
Wonderful. Okay, fair enough. Now I've got a question here, which I think a lot of us, I think, sort of assume that the benefits of free trade are taken as read, but of course, for a lot of the public who are maybe less familiar with the subject, that might not be the case. So I've got a question here from a member of the audience who suggests that, it's a long question, so I'm going to paraphrase it. I hope you'll forgive me. I think it becomes visible to everybody. Who basically suggests that British industry, domestic industry, has been undermined because of a preference for or reliance on imports, and obviously free-flowing trade facilities like this make imports easier. Would there not be an advantage, he suggests, in perhaps paying a slightly higher price for reshoring more production and supply lines? Would that not benefit the British economy? Now, I think Robert, as an avid free trader, I think you could probably take that first, but that's open to all members of the panel. I think you can all offer us a great perspective on that question. So I'm just going to put the full thing up in case anyone wants to read it. So there we go.
Thanks. Henry, look, that's a really good point, and I'm glad it's been asked, because it's something I wanted to address anyway. And in fact, before I became the Maritime, I was on the International Trade Select Committee, and the report that we published was on the impact of COVID-19 on international trade. And all the evidence that was heard from witnesses said that there was a move to protectionism, and that was a concern. And I just want to spend a few minutes just explaining why that is. Free trade is a great driver of prosperity, and as I described it earlier, as the greatest engine of prosperity that mankind has ever created. And yes, Henry, you're absolutely right. I am an avid, completely committed free trader. And there's a very good reason for that. It's because what that enables us to do is to concentrate on the things that we're good at, things where we can add value, things where we really have an advantage, and then we look to others to supply the things that they're good at, and that helps everybody. It helps us, and it also helps those emerging economies as well. The difficulty of that is it inevitably starts moving towards a protectionist stance, because you end up having to apply tariffs in order to protect your own industries, in order to do that reshoring. The difficulty of that is it means that things become better. Things also tend to become harder to come by. So it tends to have the opposite effect to that you're intending. So there has been a move, and there certainly are many voices that call for just the reshoring. But it is something I think that needs to be treated with great caution. What I do think is absolutely important, and what is really a very important point to log for the purposes of this seminar, is resilience of supply chain, which means essentially, in my view, to diversify where we obtain essential supplies from. Rather than to start trying to do everything ourselves and trying to do things that we aren't naturally set up to do, what we should be doing is prioritizing the things we're very good at, and making sure that we have more than one place from which to obtain the essential supplies we need from abroad.
Okay, now I will go to the rest of the panel on this, because I think it's an important one. But if I could just ask a quick follow-up to Robert, just to clarify something. Obviously, the government doesn't buy a particular industry or a particular company's parts, right? They go out and they negotiate that themselves. So what is the government's, when you talk about diversifying supply lines, what is the government's role in doing that? How does the government facilitate that?
Well, I think the government's role naturally should be fairly limited to the areas where the government has direct involvement. There will be some things where the government will be involved. If you're talking about supplies for the armed forces, if you're talking about supplies for the NHS, the government's going to have a role. And if we're talking about industry role, then I think that's something that's best left to the market.
Okay, James, if I could come to you. So Robert gave us an overview of sort of the big picture of why it may be better to import stuff rather than manufacture it. You perhaps could give us a more concrete example. You know, the questioner asks, given your company's reliance on so many just-in-time supply lines and everything else, would it not be better for the West Midlands or for Wales if those parts or more of those parts were manufactured locally by companies employing local people? What is the overall advantage to those areas of the current very interconnected and global-facing model?
Well, it's a broad question and a really good question. In some cases, no. Low-cost components that can be made in a cheaper country, in a factory that's making hundreds of thousands or millions of them, so they cost very little. Is that really the kind of work that we want? We should, as Rob said, play to our strengths. So in some respects, you've got to balance off supply chain resilience over the cost effectiveness of a component. And in some cases, as I said, Eastern Europe, lower cost of labor, you can have a tier 2, tier 3 supplier that could potentially have a super factory making that component for every car manufacturer in Europe. They can make them so much more cost effectively in that factory than we could ever imagine doing it. However, we do have huge amounts of intellectual capability in the UK, huge amounts of opportunities in the UK. I think one of the questions was talking about graphene. So in terms of materials and aerodynamics, I don't think there's a country in the world that's as good as that as we are. To play into these strengths that we have in both the aerospace sector and the automotive sector, we should be building upon that. That's the high tech, high value, innovative supply chain of the future that we should be investing in. Looking at the new technology around powertrain, so electric vehicles, hybridization, hydrogen, again, we should be looking at those technologies because there isn't currently a European supply chain for that. So this has become the arguments post-Brexit of where do battery factories locate themselves? Do they plonk themselves in Germany, France, or the UK? Our country's going to get into a bidding war for them. We'll see, I suppose. So I think we should play to our strengths. In some respects, in some areas, there will be strategically important components or materials that we need. Steel has traditionally been one of those. That's why we still make steel in the UK. Aluminum or aluminium will be another one of those aspects. So, we buy currently as Aston Martin, our engines come from Germany. Why? Because they traditionally have been, when we were owned by Ford, we had an Aston Martin little box within the Ford Cologne factory, and it still makes our V12. In the future, do we want to continue making engines in another country, or will it make sense to do it in the UK? Again, you have these conversations internally when you're looking at the supply chain resilience and the cost effectiveness of your vehicle. My old CEO used to use the term total delivered costs. You've got to make sure that you can get the TDCs down as low as possible. It is a cutthroat industry, the automotive sector. Margins are very, very slim, so you've got to balance off that resilience versus the cost effectiveness.
Okay, Doug, any questions on any comments on this before we continue? This is, I think, one of the big, amongst the larger population, one of the biggest perceptions or arguably misperceptions of the debate about free trade is the balance between the economic advantages of a globalized economy versus the virtues perhaps of reshoring industry and protecting traditional methods of employment. So any final comments before I move on from you on that question?
The only thing I was going to say around the supply chains on this is we've got some fantastic trade routes in and out of the UK, and they're far-reaching. They go all over the world. And I think also that it goes back to being a maritime nation, I think, and everybody's kind of playing to their strengths a bit. We did see some discussion during the COVID period where people were considering more nearshoring or moving, sourcing, being able to source product closer to where it's needed, and we could see more of that happen in the future, but. There's no doubt that there's some very, very excellent producers of components out in Asia that do them very, very well. And, so I'd agree with both what Robert and James have said is let's make certain that, we secure the components that we require, the products that we require, but also let's consider where our advantages are. And then let's invest and grow those skills and those capabilities within those areas of distinct advantage.
Okay, now I'm going to, in a second, move on to the subject of free ports, which I know has been quite a hype, but I just want to follow up on one thing that was mentioned here. James mentioned that we do sometimes keep reshore or keep onshore the strategic resources. Now, I mean, sort of steel and aluminium. Maybe Robert could say this. Who decides what a strategic resource? Very quickly, because who decides what a strategic resource is? What are the criteria for that? Because obviously, that's one of the big things about when people are debating free trade and so on, is that definition can get quite expansive. So how does the government determine what we need to keep in Britain versus what we can safely buy on the global market? Robert.
Yes, that's a good point, and it comes to the heart of this question. I mean, ultimately, if there is to be such a thing as a strategic decision, then obviously that would have to be government. The government will always try to take a relatively limited approach to that for the reasons I've given. You will see that take place, particularly amongst the defence sector, where you might decide that you want to have a sovereign capability, and as such, then that might come down to the availability of something like steel. So I don't think there is such an overarching strategy for this as such. It's something that's taking place within each sector, within each department, depending on what's important to them.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Doug, I'm going to come back to you because you mentioned, as part of your in your initial remarks, you mentioned free ports. Now, these are words that get bandied about quite a lot in trade discussion. We read about them a lot in the newspapers, but a lot of people I don't think will know exactly what a free port is, how it works. Could you just introduce us, please, to the concept of the free port and what role it's going to be playing in the Port of Dover's operations?
So free ports have been around for a very, very long time. The UK had a whole range of them. I think most of them went away by about 2012. The fundamental aspect of a free port is that you can bring stuff into the country, work with it, and then re-export it and not have to pay any tax and duty on it because it hasn't landed, hasn't entered the domestic market. And you know, for us, Port of Dover's land constrained. There's no doubt we got cliffs behind us. So, you know, creating a free zone that's adjacent to the port is not something that we could do in any, you know, given the scale of our operation, in any way that would make a meaningful difference. So when we started thinking about the free port, we said, okay, but what's going to be of best benefit or maximum benefit to the nation? And we came up with a virtual model where the free port is extended throughout the nation, because, you know, as James was talking about before, and Robert also mentioned, our freight is destined all throughout the country. And what this would enable is that for people to be able to access into those structures where you get advantages through duty deferral, in fact, duty inversion in some cases. Now, what we do know is that the government was out for a consultation. That consultation concluded in July, and government is now going through the consultation responses. We anticipate that they would be opening up for bids for free ports a little bit later in this year, but certainly by the end of the year. And they've got an ambition to award up to 10 of these free zones. And it's a competitive field. We know that there's some really great ports in the north and the Thames in the south that are all looking to try and take advantage of it. We do, however, think our model's a bit unique because of our leveraging our strengths, which is the high pace, high frequency operation.
Okay, now I'm going to go to Robert in a second, but I'm not going to pretend this is for the audience benefit. It's just, this one's just piqued my interest. What's tariff inversion?
So you can imagine if the component that you bring in carries more duty on it than the export would have, then there might be a benefit in that. So by the time it gets added to the whole, does that mean that there's more or less duty on whatever gets exported?
Okay, thank you very much. So you learn something new every time you do one of these. Absolutely love it. So Robert, free ports, I didn't know that we maybe had them until 2012. So I suppose the question for the government is, if free ports are such a good idea, and they've been around for as long as Doug says, why are we only debating setting them up now? Why has the United Kingdom not got them already? And indeed, why has it been getting rid of the ones that it apparently used to have?
That's a very, very good point. So I'll try and explain it as simply as I can, as it gets quite technical. So essentially what the term free report covers a number of concepts. And Doug's absolutely right. Historically, there have been a great many over the course of hundreds of years. And they tend to apply principally to tariffs. So the essence of a free port basically is that normally you pay a tariff when you come onto the country's shore. With a free port, you have a port and you don't pay the tariff until you take whatever it is outside of that bit of land and into the rest of the country more broadly. And so that's sort of the basic, that's entry level free port, if that makes any sense. And those are the sorts of things that were slowly petering out because of varying success rates essentially over the course of years. The government's got a very ambitious free port agenda. And as Doug's rightly said, we've been consulting on the policy proposals for that. And we are now going through and considering the responses to that. And I should say, of course, that we'll be looking at all of them and there will be a free, fair, open competition to see which of those are given those 10, the 10 awards in due course. We'll be looking at those from all over the country. But what we're looking at here is something that is actually more complicated, that's more far-reaching than what you've seen in the past. Because what we're looking at, and as I say, it's subject to consultation, there's no policy decision on that yet, but it is possible that you can do other things within those free port areas, more akin to the things you've seen in enterprise zones. And that is something around taxation or regulation differences from the rest of the country. Under the European Union, that would be difficult or impossible because of their state aid rules. So that's something we can only consider doing now that we're leaving the European Union. So in long story short, you just need to be a little bit careful when you're considering free port as to whether you're talking about the historic basic entry-level free port concept or the more advanced concept that the government is considering now.
Okay, thank you very much. James, before we move on, do free ports have any relevance for your business, your industry, any impact on how you operate?
Yes, most definitely. Obviously, the auto sector in the UK is a largely export business. So we bring components in, we add value to them, we export the finished goods. So in terms of we'd have to pay, or we can limit some of the paperwork. So there are procedures in the background here. Inward processing relief, for example, helps us mitigate some of the duties, but the free port model goes beyond that. So it would be very helpful. Certainly the virtual model that the Port of Dover are providing, because what we don't want essentially is, as an industry, it's a bit expensive to pick up a car factory and move it to a location next to a port. And one would argue that it's a little bit unfair for a new company coming into the country to get all the benefits of going to that location, and existing companies having to sort of sit back and watch and think, well, how's that fair? So the free port, the virtual free port model that Port of Dover proposed, actually has entities inland within the UK able to associate themselves with that free port model. I think we as a company certainly support that.
Fascinating. I mean, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, but there's been some fascinating stuff coming out relatively recently about when the government, back in the post-war era, the 50s and 60s, was trying to play God and plonk factories down and decide where companies could build new developments. And suffice to say, it didn't really work. So I think that those are very good points about the fact that this will allow established manufacturers to buy into a new system, and also it will allow for the more even distribution of the benefits across the country.
Yeah, I think if I can just follow up, Henry, very quickly. I mean, the challenge with the automotive industry specifically is you have to make stuff and do the R&D where the people are. Trying to tell people in the Midlands, where the Midlands is the sort of the centre of the world for UK automotive. That's where the intellect is generally. There's another sort of satellite up in the northeast. There's a bit in South Wales, but getting people to move lock, stock, and the cost for the company to move people and facilities is just prohibitive. So I think we've got to recognise that where car factories are. I mean, Lotus, for example, they make their cars in Norfolk. They're setting up an R&D centre in the Midlands. Why? Because it's difficult to convince engineers to go to Norfolk. Lovely place, but actually, if you're an engineer in the automotive sector, you probably want to stay around the heart of the automotive industry. So I think we've got to be a little bit flexible with it.
Perfect. Okay.
Something on that as well, but if I may, Henry, and James puts his on a very good point. And it just interlinks to two other things that the government is working on, which are key planks of our education policy going into that slightly wider sphere of things. And that's particularly with T levels and then the through life education announcements that the Prime Minister has made this week. This fundamentally all comes down to STEM. It's down to technical skills. It's down to having enough people of the right sorts of skills. And the government, both with T levels, with technical levels, and with the wider focus on the STEM agenda, getting more and more people into being interested in some of the technical skills. There's all sorts of them, physics, IT, manufacturing, and showing that career prospect. Also, people reskilling later in life, which has been the focus of this week's announcement. All of that is intended is to provide greater amounts of people with relevant skills in a greater number of areas.
I just want to, this is a banging a personal drum. I'm just delighted to hear anyone from the government mention T levels. One of the things I do at Conservative Home is I write about education, and this is a really important reform, which has not perhaps got the attention it deserves. But we've got a real, in this country, there's been a long history of not investing properly in technical education versus academic education. T levels are quite an exciting bit of progress, so I'm delighted that they've mentioned. Go and Google them, look them up. They're great things.
I couldn't agree with you more, Henry. It's an exciting part of the government's education agenda. And of course, with my portfolio of aviation and maritime, it's critically important.
Excellent. Now we have a question here from LCJ. She says, global corporations have the resources to adapt more swiftly. What measures would the government take to ensure SMEs are being supported instead of throttled by competition, exacerbated by additional administration? I think this is part of a broader question, which is often actually brought up in the context of the European Union debate, which is that sometimes the need for more regulation and more paperwork, it's not only just a general drag on business, but because larger companies are much better resourced and much better equipped, both to engage with government before those regulations come in and then to navigate them afterwards, it ends up raising barriers to entry and squeezing small businesses. So I'm going to start with Robert, and then I will come to any other member of the panel who has something to say on SMEs.
Yeah, again, a very timely and important question, and there's a number of aspects to it. So in terms of improving the viability and sustainability of SMEs, the education point that I've just referred to is a big part of that as well. I won't go through it again. I've just said how important I think that is. I think more broadly, this just gives us the example of how important Brexit can be as an enabler, because it gives us the ability to ensure that the regulations that we pass, if we pass, are ones that are targeted for us and aren't, of course, blanket based across the whole of the European Union. That gives us the opportunity to really make sure that industries in those key growth areas are ones that we can absolutely concentrate on. And you can see this also in the government's wider free trade agenda, because if you look, for example, at the Japanese trade deal that was agreed fairly recently, the naysayers would say, oh, this is just the European Union one rolled over, and it really isn't. And it isn't because of the digital chapter that is contained within it, which goes much further than the European Union's. That is very, very exciting for the sorts of high-tech, innovative companies that we excel at in this country. That's something that gives them a real opportunity to concentrate on the things that we're good at. And so I would encourage everybody to look at that. That's, of course, particularly important because those companies tend to be SMEs rather than the larger established companies. More broadly, this is a Conservative minister, part of a Conservative government, again, speaking at a ConHome event. And again, what we will always be looking to do is to make Britain a business-friendly place, and that means keeping regulation appropriate, but to an appropriate level.
Doug, your Port of Dover deals with exports and imports from companies large and small. In your experience, is there a difference in how different sized companies find navigating that system? Do you anticipate that Brexit might change that? Are there things that you'd like the government to do to make sure that SMEs are as able, if there are going to be any problems, to keep trading through Dover the way that the big companies can?
Yeah, and thanks, Henry. I think for in terms of the product that Dover offers, it's open for everyone and everyone takes advantage of it. We got some really big companies that use it, and we've got one-man vans going through, and we've got who knows, horses and coaches and bicycles and everything else goes through. So it's literally open for everybody. The one thing I was going to say about SMEs too, which I'm going to come back to the Freeport discussion, if I may. you know, the Global Trade and Innovation Zone, which is the Dover Freeport model, it's virtual in nature, but what that is also designed to do is to try and help bring advantages of free ports to the SMEs. And we are building such a wide and powerful coalition of engineering companies, supply chain, the manufacturers, academia, some really wicked engineering and some good technology as well, and to create this group that then can leverage off of each other's strengths, and indeed for the SMEs to be able to learn, you know, some productivity improvements or some best practices. That's what we would like to see, you know, rise up through our Freeport, the Global Trade and Innovation Zone.
Thank you. James, anything on SMEs before I think we're going to circle back to free ports, but anything on SMEs from you?
Well, I think I'll come back to my competitiveness point. I think we have to make sure that businesses large and small are as competitive as they can be. Aston Martin, we deal with a lot of small companies, small and medium-sized enterprises in the UK.
Oh, you've muted yourself, sorry.
Sorry, that's me pushing paperwork on my desk. Apologies. 60% of our suppliers are UK, and most of them are small. And I deal with on regulatory issues with a number of them. The challenge they have is it's the owner and his wife or her husband or partner or whatever in the evening trying to pick through new regulations. So we need to be very, very clear. As Rob said, there's good guidance out there on customs approaches. There's lots of driving the motorway and you get the signs about paperwork, etc. It's beholden on the big companies or the OEMs, the consumers, to try and help their smaller suppliers as well, because we're not competitive if our suppliers aren't competitive. And certainly from Aston Martin's point of view, we do deal with a number of very bespoke companies that we can't go and buy something from a company elsewhere. They don't exist. So we have to make sure that company A down the road that's making a specific component for us is competitive enough, able to do the paperwork, able to secure money from government-backed loans or grants to develop that new technology. So we all have to work seamlessly together. So it's all about competitiveness.
So I'm just going to, before we move on, I'm just going to ask you LT's question directly. Is there any specific measure that you would like the government to consider that would help SMEs? The importance of it, I don't think anybody on the panel would dispute. It would be very unusual if someone did. I don't think I'll live to see the day when a panelist of mine says that SMEs aren't important. Is there a specific proposal that you'd like Robert to take away and think about that would help to make the SMEs that you work with more competitive?
Well, I think, to be honest, the communication campaign the government's doing is very good. I mean, you don't turn the radio on, or commercial radio, that is, very often without hearing a message about new paperwork rules, new paperwork regulations. The gov.uk website is, it isn't like reading legalese. It is actually pretty clear of what you need to do. But still, if you've never done this before, you need to be able to go to someone for some help. And I would stress, I mean, it's not a request to Robert or the government, because this is down to the individual. They need to make sure that they familiarise themselves. There are trade experts out there that they can reach out to. Indeed, reach out to their suppliers, reach out to their customers, because we're all in this together. We all need to make sure that we're seamlessly working together on this one.
Okay, wonderful. Now we are looping back to free ports, but they're a fascinating subject, so no complaints from me. Now this question, I think, sort of turns some of the advantages that we've spoken about the new free ports model on its head a little bit. So this questioner asks, says, but I'm going to riff a question off it. Free zones at Shenzhen are used as deliberate tools for economic development. Now, what I want to ask is, the advantage of the more complex proposal that Robert so kindly outlined for us is that it means that it's not confined to companies in particular parts of the country. You don't need to build a new factory right next to a port in order to take part in this system. But the government obviously has a stated objective of trying to rebalance the British economy, to address the huge north-south divide, try and revive economic activity in places like the Northeast. Now, if the free port system that we establish is completely accessible wherever you are in the United Kingdom, or at least in Great Britain, does that not risk simply entrenching the competitive advantages of areas of the country which are already doing well. And that does not make it more difficult for the government to use this policy as an instrument of levelling up, as a way to put more economic activity in other parts of the country. Now, I understand that Robert, as a free marketeer, obviously there's limits to how you'd like the government to be doing that anyway, but how does the government fit that very open, very accessible model with its stated objective of rebalancing and levelling up? And that's for Robert.
Thanks. So if I've understood the question correctly, sorry, hear me okay?
Yeah, you're here now. Yep.
I'll break up for a second. Hopefully you can hear me. I'll keep answering. I can circle back over it if you miss it.
We've got you.
So if I've understood the question correctly, I think the question is essentially how can free ports be stopped from simply becoming a tool of entrenching existing advantage rather than being somewhere else. I think that was the thrust of the question. So essentially, it's because, with the obvious caveat that the policy isn't yet settled. So, we're still considering the result. That's major. It's important just to bear that in mind. The finalised policy isn't yet there. But the attraction of this policy is quite how wide it can be and quite how innovative it can be. And I think, again, as Conservatives, we tend to be people who are interested in localism. And so there is an important chance here for people in local areas and areas that particularly want investment to tailor their proposal to that end. So you have an opportunity here for, in some ways, comes down to that point about larger organisations which have already got the inbuilt advantage because they have the infrastructure. This gives the opportunity local areas to come up with a proposal and then say, well, this is what we're going to do in order to bring investment to our area. So you'll get different bids and the government will be able to assess them all. I think on the basis of that, on the basis, as I said, of an open, fair, competitive policy, then there's no reason why there would be any inbuilt advantage to areas that already have infrastructural ports.
Okay, and Doug, you mentioned that you've assembled a quite formidable sounding coalition behind this proposal. Have you got engagement from areas of the country that the government's trying to help? Places like the Red Wall and so on and so forth. Can you tell me a bit more about who's in that coalition? What's the spread around the country? Have you managed to get sort of buy-in from areas which, over the last couple of decades, perhaps haven't been benefiting from the overall prosperity of the UK economy as much as they should have been?
I think I'll do a little intro piece and then I'll come back around to the question, if I may, Henry. So, I think it's important for folks to also understand that leveling up Britain is an important thing, but it can't be done without Dover. So it's not a north-south thing. There's the amount of business and the consumers and everything that that we supply up and down the nation is we've got a role to play in that, and that's also why we've designed our Freeport structure model in the way that we have, so that it can provide that access. Now we're working with companies based in the Midlands, such as Aston Martin, being one of the premier ones, I'd say. We're working with companies based in Kent. We're working with academic institutions in England and Kent and Scotland. We've got a really great engineering firm based, I think, in Wimbledon now, that are on board. A couple of big technology companies that are kind of household names, and they're pervasive throughout. And I think the thing with one of the cited risks of free ports is so-called displacement. And what that would mean is that you set something up in a location and it sucks activity from other areas and brings it into that one. And what we've done, or how we've approached it, is we've got two strands to our free ports model. One is working through existing operational sites, and that begins to extend the benefits and then allows for some investment into those areas. But also the second strand is around some identified and growing regeneration sites, and that is good for attracting inward investment, creating many more new jobs, and it's jobs in manufacturing, but also life sciences and engineering that we're looking to create.
Okay, thank you very much, James. Any comments before I move on?
I don't think there's much more to add, to be honest. I don't think it's an either or. It's a both. That's not to say that a Freeport virtual model that Doug speaks about doesn't both help the economic regeneration of areas of the country that we want to see regeneration, whilst also providing an opportunity for parts of the country that aren't on a natural coastline. So I think it's both. I think we can look at it. I mean, the European state aid map is a very interesting thing. You look at it; it basically looks at population density and deprivation and scores parts of countries in different categories, and those categories provide a level of funding support that government or government agencies can provide. There's no reason why we can't do something similar to that around the UK. I mean, and just look at where we need to provide the support. But the custom side of it, let alone the economic development, the custom side of it doesn't have to be. It's not mutually exclusive. It could be separate.
You did have something to say after all. I knew it. Now we're coming up to the end of the discussion, but there's just one more question that I'd like to put in, which is that we've talked exclusively almost about the impact of Dover and of free ports and of trade on the UK. But of course, the UK is, Ireland is in the news a lot now. The UK is a land bridge to the Republic of Ireland for a quite substantial volume of traffic, and there's an awful lot of sensitivities about the land border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland for historical and political reasons. But I think in commercial terms, the more significant one for Ireland in terms of volume of trade is Dover, the land bridge, Great Britain. So Doug, what volume of trade through Dover do you think it goes on to Ireland? What impact do you think this will have? And Robert, is this something that the British and Irish governments are talking about? How are we going to ensure that in the event perhaps of a no deal, that vital land bridge to our nearest neighbour continues to operate? I'm going to go to Doug first and then Robert.
Thanks, Henry. I think, first of all, it's something like 40% of Irish exports to the European Union come via Dover. So it is absolutely critical, and it's a lot of the time sensitive stuff, but it's also a very efficient operation. Where if you were shipping direct, say from Dublin around to Rotterdam, it might take you 3 days or so to make that sea voyage, where you can get it done in sort of 13, 14 hours if you use the land bridge. And it is really important, and it's absolutely critical that we are able to continue to facilitate that traffic. It's important for Ireland, and it's certainly important for us.
Robert?
Thank you. Yes, this is of course a very much current issue, and it's one that's quite sensitive. If I won't go into it in too much detail, but the government will of course be speaking to the Irish government to ensure that in whatever the circumstances are, that there is an ability to get goods to and from the island of Ireland and to the UK, whatever the circumstances are afterwards. We'll obviously want to have that close relationship ongoing with our close friends and neighbours.
Thank you very much. Now that brings us to about the end of our time. I'd like to start by, normally there'd be a round of applause at this point. Unfortunately, it's only me, but I'm sure I speak for all of our guests when I say that this has been a hugely enjoyable and informative discussion. I know that we've covered some quite technical subjects in places, but I think we've done it in a way that has been accessible. I've certainly learned a lot about tariffs and free ports and all of that. So thank you very much to all of our panelists. Thank you to the Port of Dover for sponsoring this event. Obviously, this is a very unusual conference, but we've managed to make it work. Thank you, Robert, for battling with your broadband on our behalf. This is the last Conservative Home event for today, but we're running a full program of events throughout the 3 days of the virtual conference. So if you join us at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, my colleague Mark Wallace will be talking to Liz Truss at an event sponsored by the National Farmers Union. With that, I'd like to offer a final thanks to our panel. Thank you for sticking with us and tuning in. I know that there was a last minute change and we're on Zoom, which wasn't necessarily the plan, but we have made it work. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully see you again. Thank you all. Thank you to the panel. Thanks.
Thank you.